morning to everyone. Looking forward to a message from James from the book of James, right? So we're gonna sing some songs that both the James have suggested, or we could go with Matthew today. And that would, is it James preaching on Matthew?
Matthew preaching.
We had a good concert Friday night. We fed the Bethel College Choir. We had plenty of food, but not like in a Baptist amount of food. Just a significant Mennonite amount of food, where we didn't leave with so much food that we felt bad about it. And they were very appreciative, and the concert just blew us away. That building was amazing. The sound was incredible, and they were very, very good. They did a very good land acknowledgement at the beginning, and their selections were just very joy, weren't they? Were just very, very fitting for us. And so that got me thinking, we are connected to the Repair Network, and the Repair Network is active with the Land Back movement, with movements for Indigenous rights on sacred lands in specific places west of here. We don't hang our hat on that connection. We have work to do here locally as well. And I think just as the political landscape just continues to devolve in Oklahoma, our connection to the Indigenous land and our recognition of that is more and more important. There were, I think, 5 or 6 that were mentioned Friday night. When we started our land acknowledgement during COVID, we sort of clung to the Osage, Wichita, Comanche, and Kickapoo. And I think one of the others that were mentioned Friday night was Kiowa. And of course, we're familiar with names, and it's a complicated history in a place like present day Oklahoma, but we do recognize those today. Let's start in purple. 115, purple 115.
Before brokenness, hope for this day. Lord, in the suffering, listen our prayer. Pray for the children, just in your peace. Sunrise to sunset, your kingdom and peace. Shelter, Lord, find a light, for the day. For the present, give for the sin. Land for the gift of heaven, blood for the peace. Voice that to plead the call of those who can speak. Thank God of peace. Give us compassion, we pray. And the dark will hide, the tears fall like change. Change our love from the storm to proclaim. You from cruel wars, havens from fears, cities for sanctuary, we lost to death. Peace to the killing fields, torture to green. Cries for the bitterness, strong for the pain. For the rapids road, oceans and streams, wondered and poison, the future of trees. Born in the heavens, their restless streams. Make us content with the things that we need. Give us compassion, Jesus. Die to forget you. Come change our life from our soul to the lighten our darkness, breathe on this wind, until your justice reigns rightly again. Until the nations learn of your ways, seek your salvation, and take you then take. God, 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 give us compassion, we pray. Our right hand. Change our time from us all to a plan.
Flip over to blue. 322.
322.
322. You know what it is, John?
Okay, huh? I can count
You have
those.
that number memorized? For we are
Strangers on all, strangers on strangers on all, we'll never see each other. Strangers on all, we're sisters and brothers now. Oh, what will be? We will praise the Lord together. Speak joy song to song and praise together. From the light and we will work together to find the thing of the goodness for we are strangers no more, and elders apart. Strangers no more, not part of humanity. Strangers no more, to each other now. Strangers no more, we're sisters and brothers now. Where different cultures we will serve together. Sacred religions we must strive for thee. Mountain by mountain, we will bring together that justice, love, and right, your mercy. For we are strangers no more, like elders of one family. Strangers no more, like one humanity. Strangers no more, we're to each other now. Strangers no more, we're sisters and brothers now. There is a love that binds the world together. Love that seeks the last of us. There is one in the dark. Price from self and one from destiny. For we are strangers to the world, members of one family. Strangers of humanity. Strangers of one. Strangers
Good job. We gotta do that one early. So that maybe our voices will recover. Harry, grab that. Let's go back to purple 124. We're gonna keep the energy up. Get started.
My soul cries out with a joyful shout that the God of my heart is great. And my spirit sings of the wondrous things that you bring to the ones who made. Fix your sight on your servant's light, and my weakness in my strength. So the needs to restore my name, giving thanks for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day. And the powers of your justice, like a day on tears with the contrast, and the power is about to flame. I saw my God, my all, you my great things and see the last from the depths of the past to the end of the age to teach. What's the power to change for those who would carry you down? You will show your mind from the strong to the fight, for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day, king of the fires and the throne, and the for the long cross, and the world is about to turn. Mountain fortune side of the sun will be left on soul. Like a king, where your justice stands every time and on his throne. The hungry for shall eat no more, for the food they never claim. And the table spread every don't be fed, for the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day, that the fires of the Michael Betty on tears for that undrawn fear, and the world is about to turn. Like nature praise from age to age, we remember who wants us well. God's mercy must be the past from the conqueror's best she found. With saving money, but farming, saving the promise which goes us well. To the spirit of the touched by God, turning the world over. My heart shall sing of the day, that the fires of the justice like the wedding on tears for the bomb drops in, and the world is about to turn. My heart shall sing of the day, the rain of the fires of the justice like the wedding on tears for the bomb drops in, and the world is about to turn.
Joy and MCC.
Gary, I think we need to do an experiment. We'll do one offering with the drums and one without. See if we can get one.
Funny. Pray with me as you see fit. I love this place. I love these people. I am very appreciative of the work that MCC does all around the world. And the words of Ralph Ediger, even those places that our government does not agree with, we want to help those people. Amen. Amen. Purple 80s. I don't want to take too much of James's time, but this is a good one.
Karen and Derek, is the sound okay? Yeah.
James mentioned this one to me. Notice at the bottom it says traditional, spiritual, and I was looking up a little bit of the history. A lot of times when it says traditional, it might mean that we've lost some things along the way that we don't know for sure. Could be roots in African American traditions, but also there's evidence of roots of this coming out of Appalachia. So if you're not familiar with Eastern Kentucky, Western North Carolina in the Appalachian Mountains, Appalachian, it's anyone who's from there will tell you if you throw an apple at you, that's how you remember how to pronounce it correctly. One of the most unique American cultures that has existed because of the mountains, because of the holidays, because of the isolation. And so there's a lot of ethnography and those kinds of things that come out of that part of the United States. And so thinking about that, and when I was reading about it, it said that a lot of Appalachian hymns use words like lonesome because of that isolation. And I don't want to put too much commentary on it because James might have reasons for choosing it as well. But it just strikes me as descriptive and not prescriptive. And I wonder if our students know what I mean by that. If something is prescribing an idea, it's telling you that you should believe the idea. And how is that different from describing something? Which one might be biased more? I think so, right? It has an intent, right? What do we do if something is descriptive? What is that person doing?
Serving,
Okay.
saying what they see.
Yeah.
I'm telling you from their own experience.
Right. So one of the young people take descriptive and turn it into a verb.
Describe.
Describe, right? That's what they're doing. We're more familiar with that, and that is the meaning that Jeannie and Jamie gave us, describing something. So if you're describing something, you're just telling it how it is. Prescribing might be telling it how it should be. So I take the song as how it is, not necessarily how it should be. But again, James might have some thoughts along that as well.
Aaron,
Yeah.
When I was in ninth grade, we did a small musical about a family in Appalachia, and I sang a version of this song as a part of that musical.
Can you sing it for us now?
It's a little different than this one. Yeah, I'm gonna sing it as soon as it starts playing.
There's lots of versions of the song.
Yes.
We'll try to get to maybe two of them. There's a painfully slow version by Little Richard, but there's also an Elvis version that we might get into after, because there's only 3 verses here in purple. And so I've tried to bring it down a little bit easier on our voices. Jesus, Lord, this lonesome valley, he had to walk it by himself. Oh, nobody else could walk it for him. He had to walk it by himself. He must walk this lonesome valley. We have to walk it by ourselves. Oh, nobody can walk it for us. We have to walk it by ourselves. Must go and stand your trial. You have to stand it by yourself. Oh, nobody else can stand it for you. You have to stand yourself. Yeah, so Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, very different. Jesus was missing somebody. He had to walk it by himself. Oh, nobody else could walk it for him. He had to walk it by himself. We must walk this lonesome valley. We have to walk it by ourselves. Oh, nobody else will walk it for us. We have to walk it by ourselves. You must go and stand your trial. You have to stand it by yourself. Nobody else can stand it for you. You have to stand by yourself. Awesome. I mean, I really did. I was like, I couldn't even tell you what key I was in, but you found it.
Well, I had to go to my second case. The infrequently used keys. Now it's fun. Well, also it's nice that last one, it was a really old one, played it forever. It had this weird, I don't know, it had a dual resonance to it. That's one thing that's odd about harmonicas, like every key is its own instrument, so you sometimes get, the old one he'll play one kind of has this funny sound to it. So. Anyway, let me double check. Make sure this is. Wanted to record these just so if since it's a series, I wanted to, if you hear one later, if you want to catch an early one, so we're recording. So.
Cool. And I got it on there too.
Okay, great. So anyway, it is great to get to share with you this morning. This morning's message will be exploring the book of James, which is one of the books of the New Testament that I really, really like a lot. And so this morning we'll be beginning with talking about why the book of James is important. But I'm also, actually, before we do that, I'm also going to talk a little bit about my own biases coming into this. And my own belief is, and when I get to teach is that, well, I'll suppose that when I'm a student, it really aggravates me when teachers don't tell me the bias. I don't know where they're coming from. And so I really appreciate it when they actually say, hey, here's where I'm coming from, so you know. So I'm going to do that in a little bit, because I think that context is important. But after that, we're going to talk a little bit about why this book is important. And also why this book has been very controversial. A little teaser for later. Martin Luther did not like this book. We're also going to talk, after that, we'll move into talking about the context of the book, including who wrote it, who do we think it was written to, when it might have been dated, and that gets really interesting. as well as some other context. And also, we're going to try to pin the genre down in this book, but in reality, this book defies a lot of the conventional ways of understanding genre. This is a genre bender of a book. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the broader context that's behind this book. In other words, what are things that we as modern readers should take into account? And then finally, at the end of this, we're going to spend just a little bit of time engaging with a little bit of the text. And I'm actually going to go ahead and pass this out now. I think we have enough for everyone to have one, but it's just a copy of the bit of text we're going to be looking at in just a little bit from James chapter 1. So the reason we printed it out for everyone is we're going to use a method called the Chavruta method. Chavruta is a Jewish way of engaging with scriptures, but one that I think is really, really compatible with Mennonite Anabaptist ways of understanding scripture. And so I wanted to introduce this to us today. And Chavruta basically means literally friends. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we'll probably later on, we'll break into 4 small groups to talk about some texts, have some conversation together in much smaller groups, and then we'll come back together and share some of our conclusions.
Like class.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. And
Like friends.
Yeah.
What friends do.
Yes, absolutely. And part of the reason for that is, frankly, a lot of it, some people, I'm one of those people, feel pretty comfortable talking in big groups of people. Other people do not. The problem is that when we just had big groups of people, folks who don't feel as comfortable talking in big groups, we don't hear their voices. So this method lets everyone say something, and then hopefully, too, also those great ideas from the people who may not share a lot gets filtered up. And so it's a way of just trying to bring in more voices. So with that said, that's our roadmap where we're going today. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So first of all, I want to share my perspective. What are my biases? And I think there's 4 things I bring into this. First of all, I grew up in the churches of Christ, which means biblical study. There's a certain way we read scripture, verse by verse, trying to parse its plain meaning as much as possible. And while that way of engaging with the Bible has a lot of limitations, and it's a method that I don't do a lot, I also can't get it out of my head. And there are times, too, it actually is useful. And we're going to be using that method a little bit today. Also, what I do like about it, despite its limitations, is its democratic nature, because anyone can participate. So we're going to do a little bit of that, but we're doing some more things.
Can you, because I'm not familiar with the Church of Christ, when you say verse by verse, do you literally mean like verse by verse?
Yes, often it would be, sometimes it could be verse by verse is the most, especially more conservative folks to do it that way.
Mhm.
I'd say like my parents' church was a little less conservative. They might do paragraph by paragraph.
Okay.
But the idea is you read a chunk and then you talk about it. And you might find lots of cross references to other places, but you are doing one chunk of text, then another chunk of text. And there's some good things about that.
Mhm.
There's also some problems because often you end up being a little bit myopic of,
Sure.
Okay, so the second bias I bring into this is a Mennonite Anabaptist bias. And so that means I'm going to be looking for, in this text, connections of the book with Jesus' ethical teachings. One thing I learned when I got to take classes at AMDS is that the way that Mennonites read the Bible is that we look at the Bible as having a canon within the canon. That is the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' ethical teachings. And so when we read other parts of the Bible that may be less charitable, that might be kind of genocidal, for instance, we say, okay, that's there, but using the lens of Jesus, I'm going to choose to not take that in maybe the most liberal direction possible. I'm going to use Jesus as my corrective lens. And so that is something we're going to see a lot of in James. Thirdly, I'm bringing to this conversation a progressive Jewish approach, which means I'm looking at the book. When looking at the book of James, I'm not just looking at it from the standpoint of what it means for Christian history, but also for Jewish history. Because the book of James, as we'll talk about in a little bit, predates the rigid dividing line between Christianity and Judaism. At the point in time when James was writing his book, that boundary line was much more fuzzy than it would be 20, 30 years later, and that's important. Finally, I'm bringing humanism to the conversation, meaning I'm bringing a lot of skepticism, especially about the supernatural element of the Bible. And I will be seeking to find the humanity of the author and his audience. The good news is this text actually, in some ways, is not hard to read humanistically. Christianity because it focuses so much on practical ethical teachings. However, at the same time, James, the book of James, is very much rooted in a theistic understanding. God, theou in Greek, comes up again and again and again. And so, while I think it's easy to read the text humanistically to find the ethics in it, it's also, we have to also acknowledge that it itself is not a humanistic text, is a theistic text. And so I'm going to have some skepticism. So that's my background. I know each of you have your own backgrounds, and that's part of the reason later when we do the Kavruta thing, it's a chance for us all to bring what we have to this conversation. Okay, so we set the stage. Let's now talk about what do we know about the context of James? Who wrote it, who's it to, etc. Well, traditionally, who wrote it? It was James, the brother of Jesus, literal flesh and blood brother of Jesus. This was a person who would later become an important leader in the Jerusalem church, which was a Christian Jewish community. Or I was debating, should I say Jewish Christian or Christian Jewish? It's the point is at this point in time, it's a little bit blurry. But these are communities that were composed of Jews by birth, Jews by formal conversion, as well as Gerim, fellow travelers, non-Jews who still went to synagogue, who still participated in things. So that's who his context was those kinds of communities. He also was present at the Jerusalem Council with Peter and with Paul, and was reported to have been martyred in 16 CE, so fairly early on, about 30 years after Jesus. However, that's the traditional idea of authorship. Since very early times, there have been people who raised questions saying, no, I don't think it was that James. There's a few issues. One is that the book itself doesn't tell us which James it is. It just says James. We don't know which one. In the New Testament, there are 3 other Jameses. 2 of them were nobodies, people that we hear very little about, who just wind up on a list of people. So it's unlikely that the book was written by one of those 2. The other possibility is James, the son of Zebedee, but he died in the 40s, way early. So it's very unlikely he wrote the book. So the other argument is that it wasn't one of the other Jameses, then it could have been just someone else named James. This was a very common name. By the way, I keep saying James, that's our English translation. In Greek, it's let's see, let me actually write it down, make sure I'm right. It is Iakovos, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew word Yaakov, or Jacob. So this is what's weird. I think we could very easily have also called this book the Book of Jacob, not the Book of James. I don't know why. Haven't delved into the etymology of James versus Jacob, but I'll just tell you my own Hebrew name when I converted was Yaakov Matityahu, which is literally James Matthew in Hebrew. So anyway, I find it very amusing that, again, though, that it's James in English translation, but it's really Jacob. So anyway. So other people have argued that maybe it wasn't James, or it was an anonymous James, or it was not James at all, but the name was ascribed to him. And the main reason people say this is because the book of James uses too good a grammar in Greek. Now, I'll have to be upfront. My Greek is very limited, so I can't tell a good grammar from bad grammar. So but commentators since like around 200, 300 of the Common Era have said, no, James couldn't have written this. He was an uneducated Galilean, and it's perfect Greek. How could he have done it? And people since then have made that same argument. Very recent scholarship, though, has raised some interesting possibilities. One is that a lot of people previously, until a few decades more recently, said that, random rural Galileans probably didn't speak Greek. Well, we need a lot of evidence to say that probably isn't true. That probably Galileans had Greek as a common second language. They needed it, frankly, to get by in the world. It was the business language of business. It was the language of engaging with the empire. And so they probably had a working knowledge of Greek. Now, would it have been polished, perfect Greek? Probably not. But it does mean that that this might have been based on oral teachings that James, the brother of Jesus, might have given potentially in Greek. Another possibility, though, is that James himself didn't write the book, but he did deliver sermons, oral messages, and that these were later compiled by later followers of James who wrote it down. By the way, that's how we think the Sermon on the Mount came to be. Jesus, the only time I can think of in Richard, someone else might know differently, but my only recollection of Jesus writing anything in the Bible was a story in the Gospel of John when remember when the woman was brought to him who was caught in adultery, and they say, "What do you do?" And then he's writing on the ground, and then he says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." There's lots of conjecture by the way what he was writing on the ground. Some people thought he might have been writing the names of people there in the audience and writing down their sins. No one knows. It's just conjecture. Point is, Jesus was writing there, but that's the only time we see him writing. We don't have a book of Jesus, by the way. And so someone wrote down what he said. And that would have been an interpretive process of picking, okay, which of his greatest hits do we write down? Which of his quotes do we write down? So it's very possible the same thing happened with James. Someone else wrote it down. We don't know. Personally, I think that last theory that other people wrote things down that James himself said, to me, holds the most water. I think to me, the reason why I actually really like the idea of James, the brother of Jesus, being the author is that his way of speaking seems so much like Jesus. There's a lot of how James articulates things. It reminds me a lot of the Sermon on the Mount. And so while I can't prove it, I think that there's at least no evidence we would decidedly say it couldn't have been James, the brother of Jesus. But I also will say that I think it's likely someone else did the writing, that he himself may have not have done the writing, but that it was part of this tradition. A few things I'll mention if James, the brother of Jesus, was the author. One is it does put a hard line on dating, because James, the brother of Jesus, died in 62 CE. Now, is it possible that people after him wrote down stuff that James said before 62 CE, and that's what wound up in the book? Yes, that is possible. But we at least know an approximate, it wouldn't have been long after that, probably would have written down. Because of this, we can say that kind of the range of possibilities in dating is somewhere in the mid 40s up until around, say, mid 60s. So this means the book of James was very early on, possibly the oldest or one of the oldest books of the New Testament. James would have been writing at the same time that Paul was writing some of his epistles, or maybe even a little bit before that. One other thing I should mention about the dating, if we were right about who wrote the book, James never mentions the destruction of the Second Temple in his book. And he was writing to a Jewish Christian audience, we believe. So that's another thing that would confirm a hard line of how far out it could be. Very unlikely it would have been after 70 when the Second Temple was destroyed. Even if people later wrote down what James was saying, I personally think they would have found it hard to resist putting something about the Second Temple's destruction in there. The fact they didn't tells me it can't be older than 70 at the very least. Lastly, if James, the brother of Jesus, was the author, I think it would also help to really convincingly put this in the context of being written to Jewish Christian communities, because he was a well-known leader of Jewish Christian communities. Okay, so we're going to assume for the rest of this series that the author was James, the brother of Jesus, but again, there's still question marks, just want to keep that there. But I do think it helps later to make this assumption because it helps to explain some things. Okay, next, we talked about authorship. Let's now talk about who was he writing to. Well, in fact, if you look at the handout in that first, and do we have an, okay, we got it. In that first verse, we get the, it says, from James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered across the land of Israel, greetings. In Greek, it literally says diaspora, and that's where we get the word diaspora in English, is from the Greek. And so I have read a few commentators, mostly evangelicals, who want to say the 12 tribes in diaspora was really referring to all Christians everywhere. But I think they're wrong. I think this is specifically speaking to a Jewish Christian audience in diaspora. And the diaspora part is important because remember, by this point, Jews are scattered out, are not just in the land of Israel, but they now scattered all throughout the Roman Empire. We know that they're in Rome. We know they're in other major cities of the Roman Empire. We know they're especially in Egypt, lots of Jews in Egypt, and there are many Jews in Babylon. By the way, why would you think there might still be Jews in Babylon? Any guesses?
I would think maybe they would be really poor people that wouldn't have had the means to move
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah, well, I would say that I think that's a really good point. Poverty as being a who, because you remember when the land of the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered and later sent into captivity in Babylon. So at this point, all of the elite of the land was cleaned out, sent to Babylon. Then I want to say 60, 70 years pass, and then some of them go back when the Persians control things. The important thing is most of them did not go back. And so many Jews stayed. Some left because they simply did not have the financial means to go back. They were too poor. Other people were actually too rich. They had done too well in Babylon, and they now ran businesses. They now had a life there. So it was an interesting mix of people. But for Jews today, we say thank goodness that the Jews stayed in Babylon because there were Jews in Babylon is why we have the Babylonian Talmud, the main interpretive document that Jews use today to make sense of things.
James, I wanted to ask real quick, what translation is it?
This is the Common English Bible.
Oh, okay.
So, and I like it because it is a little more inclusive in its verbiage, usually, particularly about gender issues. It's not perfect. Yeah, there's some things I would have worded different even in this first verse, but it's overall pretty decent translation. So anyway, sorry, where was it?
You're talking about the Babylon.
Yeah, oh yeah, the Babylon. So anyway, Jews were scattered all over the place at this point in time. And so that's important. We're talking about diaspora. It could mean a lot of different people. Also, as the Jewish community had spread, and again, this is outside, we talk Jews in Babylon, that's outside the Roman Empire at this point. So we have Jews all over the place. And then by this time period, somewhere between 40s and the 60s, Christianity was also spreading. And initially, Christianity was a sect within Judaism. In other words, it was Jews who were coming to the conclusion that Jesus was the Messiah, that began to say that Jesus was the Son of God. Those elements in particular were the common elements of the Jewish Christian communities. What exactly they saw of God, did they understand Jesus as God, as part of the Trinity? That's a little more of a hazy question, to be honest. And the book of James, I think, hints at that a little bit. But at this point, the Jewish Christian communities were people who were still doing Jewish things, and saw themselves as Jewish, but who had these unique views about the Messiah, of seeing it specifically as Jesus. And so because of this, at this early point in time, this message was spreading throughout Jewish communities. And in these Jewish communities, remember that the composition of these communities was also much more varied than we think. We tend to assume that everyone was born Jewish at this point in time, but that is not true. In the first century, in the Common Era, many people were converting to Judaism, and many other people were choosing not to convert, but to still be associated with this community. Some of this, in fact, I've read some sources that argue as much as 10% of the population in some areas of the Roman Empire were in some way connected to the Jewish community. Why is that? That's a great question. My theory is that the universal applicability of this faith made a lot of sense. The fact that it also gave people a better status than they had in some other religious traditions, I think was a positive thing. But for whatever reason, and monotheism, I think, was catching on as an idea within the broader context. But of this community, a significant number of people fall into the category of being Gerim, or non-Jews. By the way, Ger is the word, it's like this for just the singular word, it just means nation or people. By the way, today we often hear the word Gentile, referring to non-Jews, but the word that was used then would have been Ger, or Gerim in the plural. And these are people who are part of the community. These are people that belong to synagogues, that contributed to their upkeep, who participated, but were people who chose to not convert. Now, any guesses why conversion, making that decision was a dicey move in the first century? Think in a very practical way about this.
Because it's a very painful process.
Yes, bingo!
Oh,
Circumcision was absolutely seen as mandatory for conversion in Judaism at this point in time. And circumcision was not the relatively painless antiseptic procedure it can be today. There's no anesthesia. There's no understanding of modern germs. And so quite a few people got infected from from circumcisions. And so, as you can imagine, it was not a popular concept. It was the main sticking point. That is, I would also argue why later the controversy about circumcision took on so much heated, because there are people who strongly thought this is essential and other people who didn't. And there were something at stake, So anyway, because of this, I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent here, but the important thing here is that the Jewish community was quite a bit more varied than just Jews by birth. And now you have Christianity coming into the mix. And initially, again, Christianity was a sect within Judaism. And then over time, there are now also Paul is at work. He's now spreading the message to non-Jewish communities and is not saying that they have to become Jewish or even be associated with the Jewish community to be Christian. And so now you have the beginnings of splitting of the paths, but it's still not a hardened line. All this to say is that as these two communities are kind of in these transitional stages, at this point in time, you have writing instructed at one of these sides or the other. James is writing his letter, his book to the Christian Jews. So he has a very specific audience in mind. But I think another point we can say about the dating issue again is that the fact James does not mention circumcision at all. It doesn't come up in his book, that controversy. We know Paul talks a lot about it, which is why I think James is writing in an earlier point in time. I think the fact that it doesn't even come up says this is a point in time when in the Jewish community, it's well accepted that Goyim come here. They're a part of our community. But they're not Jews. So in other words, it's this idea that, yes, you're community members and you don't have this status. This was not a controversial idea at the time. And so James, it's a non-issue. He doesn't bring up circumcision because he's probably part of synagogues himself where, yes, there's people who have Jewish status and people who don't have Jewish status, and we all come here to worship God together. It was a non-issue. But I do think that the fact that this isn't even coming up as an issue does tell us a lot about dating. Also, I'll mention that later on, a lot of other issues come up that further divide these two communities. One of the biggies is the coming of the first Jewish-Roman War. That was when Jews rose up against Rome, sought to revolt against Rome. But then that revolution was brutally crushed. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. In the aftermath of that one, and then another revolt, I believe in the 120s, this really pushed the two communities apart. One of the reasons was, very practically speaking, for the Christians, being not known as Jews was helpful after these revolts in the Roman Empire because Jews had a target on their back. The Romans no longer trusted Jews. And so people who are already on the margins of the Jewish community, for them to walk away and say, oh, we're not Jews anymore, it increased their longevity. And also, I think that one thing that along with this was you also had the strong teachings of Jesus saying that to not use violence to accomplish your goals. And so I think this was another reason why these two communities split ways at this point in time. Also, one other thing we can say about the audience, I think James was writing specifically to a poor audience. I don't think there's any way in the world this book would have survived if there were rich people in his audience. You read the whole thing, he is probably the most anti-capitalist writer of the New Testament. He pokes them again and again and again. The fact that he could do this and the book survived tells me that at least its original audience was mostly communities who saw themselves as poor, communities that saw themselves as oppressed. And so I think in reading this, we need to try to put ourselves in that mindset. That he's not talking to comfortable middle-class people, certainly not rich people. He's talking to poor people. But lastly, I will also say about the book of James' audience. I think it's very clear that this book also would have very quickly received an audience outside the world of Jewish Christians. The reason for that is that Jewish Christians as a movement mostly went away by the end of the first century. These Jewish revolts and some other factors really very quickly caused these communities to disappear from the historic record. And so if the book of James had only been circulated among Jewish Christians, it hadn't been circulated among non-Jewish Christians, then the book wouldn't have survived. And I think this is because a lot of the practical themes discussed in the book of James are applicable to all kinds of people. There is a universal applicability to it. Okay, So we've talked about our setting, we've talked about our audience, we've talked a little bit about its time and place. Let's now talk about a little bit about genre and literary structure. First of all, language. James uses very polished Greek, at least that's what the commentators say. There's a high degree of sophistication and a lot of really subtle plays on words. It does appear the book was written specifically to communities of Hellenized Jewish Christians, that is, Jews who spoke Greek and who shared many attributes of Greco-Roman culture, but who also maintained their Jewish identity. In other words, these were outsider insiders, people who didn't quite fit in, but also were not completely opposed to engaging with the broader world. Now, if we look at who does James quote from and who does he allude to? James doesn't quote a lot, but he alludes to Jesus' teachings a great deal. In fact, I had one commentator I looked at said that he did this more than any other book of the New Testament. And this one commentator argued that James was likely quoting from a pre-existing oral tradition of the sayings of Jesus. Remember, if we have James's dating right, this predates any of the four Gospels. This book, James did not have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to base this on. So one of the possibilities are, we know that there are these oral sayings of Jesus. Later, the scholars say, oh, that's the fabled Q source. We don't have the Q source. It's just conjecture. But it does appear that at some point, Matthew and Luke were basing their text on Mark and previous unknown source. And so one of the ideas is that James was referring to the same unnamed source. We also know there's a lot of other allusions and a few quotes of other Jewish writings of his day, including a lot from the Hebrew Bible. But it appears that James always quoted from the Septuagint, which was the very common Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. And this was the version, frankly, that if you looked in diaspora outside the land of Israel, what version of the Bible would most Jews out diaspora be familiar with? It would have been the Septuagint, this Greek translation. So James, another way of saying this is that James isn't using King James Version that people don't understand. He's using an IV. He's using something that's easy. He's using the language when he's quoting the Bible people be familiar with. Okay, what is James's genre? Is it an epistle or a letter? Well, maybe, maybe not. The beginning of this sure sounds like it. From James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered outside the land of Israel, greetings. That sounds like the start of a letter. However, other parts of the letter do not work like a letter at all. There's no personal greetings. James doesn't say, oh, my friend Bob, be sure and tell him hi for me. Paul does that a lot in his epistles. He greets various people he knows. James doesn't do that. We also don't see any kind of goodbye message. We don't see a benediction, this traditional blessing that you often see in these letters. And so because of that, there's a lot of folks argued that this actually wasn't originally an epistle, but it was kind of framed as one because that was something people were familiar with. We don't know. So what else could it be? Could it be a sermon or a collection of sayings from several sermons? I think very likely yes. It does feel a lot like the Sermon on the Mount, covering many topics, but in a jumpy fashion. James often changes the subject really quickly with no connection. That sounds a lot like people have taken favorite sayings from sermons and then they later put them together in a book. We don't know, but it's possible. Negative. It doesn't sound like it could have been a single sermon because he talks about a whole lot of topics in one message. And so it seems to me that if it had its origins in sermons, it would have been collections. Another possibility, is it wisdom literature? Wisdom literature was a common genre of that time. It was popular in both Jewish and non-Jewish circles, and it would definitely explain the choppy nature of the text, but also the universality of it. Very little of the book of James is only applicable to one type of person. It often has applicability to many types of people, which would be very much in line with wisdom literature. The negatives, or the cons of saying it's wisdom literature, is that first of all, there are these epistle style elements, such as the beginning of this. So you don't see that in wisdom literature. Also, the book neglects certain themes that always seem to come up in wisdom literature, most notably household codes. In this time period in the Roman Empire, most philosophers all felt the need to give a household code, which basically set the order of who should obey who. In our ears, and I think even in their times, to me it feels very authoritarian. But that was how the first century functioned. Everyone had to have a place, and you had to spell out what that place was and set the boundaries. And if you didn't do this, you were leading to anarchy and disorder. James doesn't feel the need to do this, which I think is kudos to him, frankly. But I would also say that it might indicate maybe that it doesn't quite fit strictly that wisdom literature genre. Anyway, all this to say, we don't know. It could be epistle, could be wisdom literature, could be a set of sermons. We don't know. So that gives us our context. We're now to the fun part, which is to move into the text itself. And so what we'll do for this is, I think what we'll do this morning is there's 3 paragraphs of this. Yeah, there's 3 paragraphs actually in this text too. There's an intro paragraph, there's a second paragraph, and a third paragraph. And so what I'd like us to do, and unfortunately I'm realizing now, I was going to ask y'all us to take turns reading these paragraphs, but the printout is really crummy on this. Let's see what we have.
It's still possible.
You can read, okay.
Yeah.
So why don't we have 3 volunteers, so one person just read verse 1, next one read the second, and then the third paragraph. So who would like to do the first?
Okay, I can go. Let's see. So from James, the slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered outside the land of Israel, greetings. My brothers and sisters, think of the various tests you encounter as occasions for joy. After all, you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let this endurance complete its work so that you may be fully mature, complete and lacking in nothing. But anyone who needs wisdom should ask God, whose very nature is to give to everyone with without a second thought, without keeping score. Wisdom will certainly be given to those who ask. Whoever asks shouldn't hesitate. They should ask in faith without doubting. Whoever doubts is like the surf of the sea, tossed and turned by the wind. People like that should never imagine that they will receive anything from the Lord. They are double-minded, unstable in all their ways.
Thank you. And then who would like to read the next paragraph?
Brothers and sisters who are poor should find satisfaction in their high status. Those who are wealthy should find satisfaction in their low status because they will die off like flowers. The sun rises with its scorching heat and dries up the grass, so its flowers and its beauty is lost. Just like that, in the midst of their daily lives, the wealthy will something away. Those who stand firm during the testing are blessed. They are tried and true. They will receive the life of God hath promised to those who love him as their reward.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to just point out a couple of quick contextual things, and then after that we'll move into our Karuta time.
Hi, James.
First of all, the first verse in particular is kind of dense. There's a lot there. In Greek, it says Iakobos Theou. So Iakobos is Jacob. Jacob, then it says Theo is God, and Kurio and Lord. Iesu Christu, Jesus Christ, Christo or Christ, which means Messiah or anointed one. Doulos, which I believe is servant or slave. Tais Dodeca, Velais Tais in Te Diaspora, Kyrene. So some of the other important words there, doulos means servant or slave, but what word in English? Doula,
Yeah.
yes, someone who helps bring life into the world, a midwife. Again, though, to me, this also shows the complicated nature of this word, because in Greek, it literally means, it's most often translated slave. So it is, what I will throw out there is, and this is where words have different resonances and meanings in different contexts. Very often in Hebrew scriptures, well, a few times at least, there are people referred to as being a servant or a slave of God. Usually prophets, I believe Moses was used in that kind of imagery, but it's not necessarily the implications of it. We read a little bit differently than we would read it today. On the other hand, in the practical life of most people who actually were doulos in the literal sense of the word at that time, this was not a position of honor. This was a position of with not having control. But also, I think how James is using, I think he's really trying to echo that idea of Moses as a servant or slave of God. Also, the other big word that jumps out of this is diaspora, just like in English. Now, notice here also, what does this text say about who Jesus is? We hear Jesus is referred to as Lord, Curio, and he's referred to as Christ. What is it not? What would we expect to be here that isn't here?
Son of God.
Son of God isn't here. What else?
I mean, a divine attribution of God.
Yes. So he is not being referred to as God. So the Trinitarian idea isn't present in this piece here, and that's an important bit of context. Other than that, I think those are the main issues. So let's for our Kavruta times, we're going to do about 10 minutes for Kavruta time, and so we'll break up into 4 groups of about 3 people. And the questions I want to ask is to grapple with are: one, was there something in what we talked about in the introduction that we want to impact some more that might be significant? But secondly, what do we think of James's advice? Wisdom literature gives advice. It tells you how to live a better life. What do we think of James's advice? Is he giving good advice here to those who are suffering? Is he giving good advice on the subject of prayer and faith? Is he giving good advice about poverty and how we should see ourselves? So those are the questions. My suggestion is we kind of just feel free to move chairs around, whatever we need to, but we'll have about 10 minutes to break up in groups of 3 and talk about this. So.
Did it work? Sure. A friend.
There be an exam?
No, this is ungraded.
Okay, Derek, and who else is it? I guess it's you and me, Derek.
Yeah.
You want to put us in a breakout room?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Okay.
So we'll do a breakout room. That's a great idea. Let's see here.
Okay.
All right.
Hey, James,
Yeah.
I hear that when James talks about trials, Jesus in John 16:33 talks about tribulations. So trials are short, tribulations are long, I guess. But yeah.
Well, I'll hear more. I can't hear. It's kind of loud in here right now. So when we come back together, you can share that. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, join the breakout room. Okay, what happened to the join button?
I'll see if I can just automatically.
Okay, it didn't take, so
Yeah.
the join button popped up momentarily and went away.
We'll see. There must be a way I can manually add. I'm gonna redo it.
Somehow Derek got in it, but I didn't.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
When she needed help.
Keeping scores.
Derek, we have some problems with the breakout rooms. We're gonna try it again.
Okay.
Their understanding. They don't understand what they believe about Christ is the thing that they and so when you said these are the things we have to believe, we have to act. And you're so rigid, you don't really understand why you believe that.
But I think.
And that it's possible to question,
You know,
then you sacrifice anything that's in the way.
Questions, I don't think questioning is allowed.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
I like the.
Question others. They don't tell you what the subject is.
Yeah,
They're
serve when
supposed to believe what you're supposed to believe what they're.
It's funny.
Yeah,
So,
but it's just,
yeah.
I think.
Here's a question. I got an example of my own family. My mother and dad, both died really young, and my mother never remarried
Lacks wisdom, you should ask.
until he died because she thought that would
Oh, yeah.
be what would be the name?
Will be adultery.
Adultery, yeah. So
Yeah.
my mother waited, my dad went out when I died at 56. When he died, my mother got
I
married.
think I get it, but like.
That's like my mom still has to tell everyone here.
Rich.
But my wife,
Only
happy she was biblical reasons. She had to explain that, because otherwise I'd be an adulterer.
Yeah,
I mean, that her first husband, Gino.
yeah.
But that makes no difference.
You know, like, yeah, physical abuse doesn't count.
I told my mom, I said, Mom, I wish she'd left her. She 6 months in marriage. It's like, you should have left him there. We could have been together all that time.
Yeah.
That's what you have.
But yeah.
And my mom said I should be.
Oh, you're about
his faithfulness rather than just.
They're low status, so not well status.
Well, we got into that topic. Ralph was saying.
Yeah, only by satisfaction, yeah.
Being able to question and that's. And who the author of David. You know, this is.
The author of Genesis, flexibility there. And I made me think of my home chart, he said this is my home church. I didn't read his question. Already said that this book clearly was written by your brother. There's no flexibility, you just accept everything.
Yeah.
Accept it. Accept.
That's all you got.
That's all you're gonna, that's ever gonna make.
The context and
Yeah.
using the
But
language.
did I tell you about, I
It's not even
contemporary leadership in class?
Oh,
I got the chance to choose a person or an organization. to talk
Keeping the
about
language of the people who are doing
their
business
leadership
in
values.
centers and maybe-
You're going to the whole class, right?
There's some,
Microchips.
there are some agricultural references, but not on.
Most
But I
church
know like that
goes
has some like wildflowers withering away.
And a couple
Yes,
silly ones
this is
that
nature.
are like
They're not
really
So I think you're right, I know make a question.
right leadership skills, but like, you know, obviously you know what they're building.
So who knows, it's intended to be where Jesus has to round up. They didn't have means violently.
Other
So
ones
they
that
were
got
most likely
here.
to make it.
About like
Trade. and
all like
whatever.
these organizations that he's a part of and stuff like that, and he's positive attitude.
What were the other
And
questions?
then one group chose villain. And when
Like,
they
what do we
went
think
to
of the
this,
Oh,
James?
oh, they chose the villain. He's like, duh. No,
I see.
they chose him over.
Yeah, me too.
And they're talking about like what a good daddy is,
That
how inspiring, and like
teaching
the whole class was
people to,
like so.
I know that's
yeah.
not what it's saying
mental
here.
toughness or whatever.
It's weird because it was like,
There are.
I
positive
understand
aspects.
that not everyone
But then in the next
in
Don't
the
get it.
leadership
Yeah.
scholarships.
Every
was
good
like-
gift.
But that also gets toxic.
Look, I
Oh, yeah.
understand there are.
So, you know, to me,
things
the
that
three
they
are
don't
the
know,
jobs,
like,
because they have
really
realize that
so
if you don't have faith, if you think, if you have enough faith, anything will happen.
Which I thought at one
It sure sounds like broke
It's true
Jesus,
when it
because Jesus
says
is not the
that.
broke guy.
So I don't know.
You know, the whole part, I tell them not to move, stuff like that, it's like,
Or if they truly.
sorry,
do
that's not
believe
where I live.
Super.
And
It was
so,
our
that part, but to me,
very
that I also still say,
thing.
he's being
And me and my friends are talking about it.
Jesus did it
I
too.
don't really know where
I
that
don't think we
came
should
from.
have that. So,
I guess you could,
Consequences, the natural consequences.
I guess you could be like.
Of course, I really like
out
the
I don't know
you know, talking about,
What,
you know,
what
the
he's done,
dynamic of.
yeah,
of
why, what
and,
he's done.
He definitely has an orientation.
You know what I mean? Like, it was just, it was a very, it was a good conversation.
You know, he's saying,
And I
I guess like in the first part of
And I
that.
guess I realized that there were
You
people
know,
that
it says if
truly
you lack
thought,
wisdom, you should ask.
well,
for
the
it.
leadership room with people,
And then,
like, oh, if you're wealthy, you have leadership
I think my
skills.
brain automatically shifts into.
It's like not true.
the way that I understand
Cause
it.
then
I remember
we got to,
reading
we
this
would
growing up.
give it, we had another group was
Talking about
like, give it a
fighting
passion.
now.
My group got well this year,
Material goods.
another group got.
And so, like Jason said.
Marketing,
not
another
good
person,
business.
another group got,
We're not talking about.
He's not talking about.
the
Yeah,
the
really.
fragmented
Yeah.
And see, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
news and literature.
But then he's like.
Right.
"We're asking you to take-
Rather
They should
than,
ask you without doubting, without doubts." See, People like that.
Al-Qaeda
I would
leader,
imagine they'll
like,
believe
great.
anything.
Another group got,
And so it's like, yeah, there's that like prosperity gospel kind of thing that's latched onto that, the latter part of that.
Yeah.
Like a lot of, there were probably half of it were like not villains, but like
That's a theme that James uses a lot.
some of them were like
First
rich people that just like did stuff,
I don't
right?
like calling mine.
But the deal was they covered that, it was like, hey, this guy was a famous
And that's why I do actually
businessman
tend to think.
in like the
that
fifties,
had it
all these
brother
companies, but
Jesus,
that
because it does seem to kind of have the same.
that's not why he got leaders. This is not like,
She don't have that.
oh, like the lady that started Chanel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I was thinking, you know, my parents. pretty good.
I'm sure he's done.
Well, out of the Bible.
I wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Change.
How about-
Well, you know, I'll say this constantly, when I learned to read, what were the first two books of the Bible I read? James and Matthew. James because it was short, and Matthew because it had a good story. And they both had my name in it, so it's like obvious this is where I began. So I think it's value doing that.
I am. I don't read the Bible nearly as much as I should.
You're
And I
another
have
resident
read
Mhm.
in the history class. And they're
Wanted
talking
to be
about
optimistic, but
some
I didn't feel like we were.
that,
When people ask you what are some of your favorite.
that like,
Bible, I will
this
always
was
do
rich
that.
or like
Basically.
And I'm not sure I read
seen
it
as a leader, but
critically,
he saw he
but
was,
I have
you know,
enjoyed
what
reading
would
it.
get
It's
into
good.
it.
I think it's the most Mennonite. I think it's.
Maybe
You know,
that's why.
like if you're in a history
I think
class,
so, it hits so many
and
of the
they're
same,
like,
to me.
now
it
this
doesn't
guy
feel like
is
it's
really important, like a
That's
leader.
very similar.
But he was just
The
like
first piece
major
of
powerful.
advice
Like it wasn't just your scale.
Yeah, it's really.
What do you judge yourself?
Yeah, that second or third paragraph about the.
Judge yourself.
Just,
how
just
highlighting
has
Yes.
ways.
there are poor people and there are rich people.
And then,
The poor people should be like,
once you have that straight.
they're high status.
It goes
Rich
ahead
people,
to,
Yeah, should, well, what is he say? Find
Fine.
satisfaction in their low status. And he's like flipping the.
That makes sense.
the script, yeah, because
Yeah.
in ethics like Jesus, it's from the mouth, like, that's, Jesus flips everything upside down.
Yeah.
And James is like.
But they
right.
And the only place that's gonna happen is in their community. The rest of the world doesn't see it that way.
Right.
The rest of the world can understand it's free. So they're finding different values in their community.
And it.
Any empire thing that he's built has been like
American Christian.
constantly.
Oh,
constantly
you know,
people, I guess, like.
Which.
Constantly.
Try to like, do this class warfare thing. And see, but Jesus didn't have a problem with it.
Oh,
He
no,
had a
no.
problem with, like saying.
Both
Should be ashamed.
using some Jewish wisdom.
My question is, what do you do with your money? Continue to help other people? I think that's the, I mean, I think that's the question.
Status.
Yeah.
Values,
I think you do.
but it's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm universal, human.
Concerned about making a rich.
Mhm.
They work pretty hard.
Judge yourself. How don't you
That
know?
was
Yeah.
Just like most of my research, and honestly, like,
He firmly
this
believes
wasn't sort of like Kennedy
a
or
rich man.
It's just down there by him.
terrible, but
It's
that's,
harder
it's
for
hard
him,
to,
but
that's
it's
hard.
harder to deal with a rich man. He makes him-
Or is it-
He can read that.
I think it was Wesley, that Charles Wesley was saying that if I die with more than a certain number of funds in Wisconsin, call me a liar. Because I wasn't faithful to anybody else at first. Yeah, so that's there.
Yeah, and it's
It's like a- Yeah, it's like one of
the heart. And you like to.
He's great fun. Strong.
This is your 1 minute warning. We'll be coming back together in 1 minute.
Yes.
We should, I think we should.
There's this tiny one that's been sitting at,
Okay, you think we should get one?
probably once a week now, that literally has giant signs.
But how long do we know we're gonna live? You don't give it away and then you run out of money and that's the hard part. What if you're
Yeah.
Moses and you have to pay that
And it's pretty much.
I figure that part. I guess you give it out after you die, you make a
I don't
will.
know, it
That's
takes so much time, so I don't know what kind of.
Because I don't know if I'll be.
And they sell signs that they're selling. Papers,
Yeah.
Make sure
Jesus.
it's in there. I'm like, oh my God. It's like it's so confusing. And then we're in class and people are like, what is this say? The table, yeah. And I'm like,
For the next.
and we're all, and there's a couple of us like telling them about it and like, hey, I'm confused, so they don't
Imagine
like,
cost.
they don't like the 8%. Like, no, they're like, what do you mean? I thought everyone was really simple.
Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up our conversation, and then what we're gonna ask each group to do is to share just a little bit from your group, some of the thoughts your group had. So I'm gonna go ahead, since there we are, I'm over here by the computer. I'm gonna go ahead and would Karen or Derek, would one of you like to share a little bit what your group discussed?
Yeah. Derek was in the history part or the background information. He was it struck him about the circumcision and how it was done with no anesthetic back then. But also, that this is Jesus' brother writing this, who had probably access to him all throughout his growing up years, and had heard him say things that maybe he discounted at one time, but then as he came to faith was able to remember some of the things that he had heard him say, and maybe some things that at first he had disagreed with that might have been meaningful to him. And that, being a Christian is more than just belief. It should impact our way of living. One of the verses that we thought was good advice was the be slow to speak, or quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
So now for the next group, let's this group bring me over here.
We decided that the person with the highest IQ would be a speaker, so Terry, take it away.
What? We didn't know.
You do it.
Well, Ralph appreciated just the ability to be flexible and understanding, just talking about context, because his home church growing up, it was just, this is the brother of Jesus, and this is the way you view everything. And if you question things, you're out. What did we talk about? I don't know where to start. Someone else. Ralph, take it away.
Well, we drifted off into, I taught a story. Another example of inflexibility is that my favorite Sunday school teacher went through divorce in my church at the time of her greatest need, threw her out of the church. How inflexible. Then last time we talked about how John and I are going to do on Judgment Day, because we feel that the Bible passage that says it's harder for a rich man to get to heaven than a camel to go through an eye of a needle. So, John and I were talking about how are we going to do on Judgment Day. So we talked about that a little bit. And I mentioned my mother. She was divorced early. My dad was an alcoholic, but she didn't remarry until he died. She was single 30 years, and then she remarried because she didn't want to be an adulteress. The way she was Church of Christ, and they believe if you married once, you can't be an adulteress if you married again when he's still alive.
One thing that I remember saying that I hadn't really noticed before, the first paragraph, the way that we hear this is often like kind of prosperity gospel, like, if you don't believe that God can give you anything, give you that job or give you that, he says, whoever doubts is like the surf of the sea tossed and turned in the wind. People like that should never imagine they'll receive anything from the Lord. Well, he's talking about wisdom.
Wisdom.
Yeah. And I think people strip that idea from what he's saying. He's saying, ask God for wisdom and God will give you wisdom. He's not saying ask God for a Porsche and God will give you a Porsche. But that's how most Christians read this. It's like, if you don't doubt God can do anything, or give you anything. But You might doubt that, especially since he says good people are.
Right, or even the every good and perfect gift comes from above. Like, that's in the context of this, how we judge ourselves, you know, like not in the context of abundance or prosperity theology.
Absolutely.
Like no matter how hard you pray or how hard you think you're working, it's like things in life don't like just magically happen. So then that can get really dangerous if you're like, well, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and then the thing that I wanted to happen didn't happen.
Yeah.
That can get really hard for people.
Okay, for the group that's kind of in the middle of the ring, what were some of y'all's thoughts?
Well, we noticed that he tries to get people's heads straight about their value of themselves and others
Mhm.
in a different way than the world generally assigns importance and value, you know. And once you do that, you got a better crack at wisdom.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's that really cool little allegation that if you desire wisdom, just ask God. And it made me remember a time in life when we had a really hard decision to make.
Mhm.
And we wanted to make the right decision for the right reasons. But we had no confidence in making that decision or in the voices that we usually trusted to influence us. We just read that one day and it was like, well, you know, maybe we're making this. We do desire wisdom and we can ask God. We can just ask. And I think it says something about a loving God. Well, I mean, it goes on to say a God who is generous, doesn't find fault. You know, he's not going to smush you because you need wisdom.
Also, in the spirit of International Women's Day, I like to find the feminine attributes of God, or even of other people, just the feminine energies in scripture. And I find it interesting that this particular text that you've picked out for us starts with that doula term. Somewhere in the middle, well, towards the end, in verse 15, it talks about these cravings. Once those cravings conceive, they give birth to sin, right? And then coming out into verse 18, talking about God being the creator of all things and the giver of good gifts, he chose to give us birth by his true word. It was just interesting to see that progression of the birthing and birthing through God's word. So.
Well, and one other wrinkle, wisdom is so often personified in scripture as feminine. Like I was like, it's personified kind of thing. So you're right. There's a lot of female energy here. Okay, so for the group over on this side, what were some of y'all's thoughts?
One thing that occurred to me that I did want to share is when I read that brothers and sisters who are poor should find satisfaction in their high status. I just thought of me as somebody who was satisfied with where she was, you know, and not that they didn't have money, because they did have, but they didn't live like they had. What the way most of the world does, and that popped into my mind as soon as I read it.
My mind went to a specific place. Like, so sometimes people say money won't make you happy. I think that's BS. I mean, I think it can totally make you happy. But the problem with being a person who money makes you happy is money makes you happy. Money is the thing that makes you happy. Like, that's the problem. That becomes the problem. And then it's like, will anything else make you happy? If that's the thing. And that, I don't know you know, I didn't really see that in the text, but my mind went there. It's like, kind of sucks. And James was like, you know, if you're rich, like, good luck. Kind of stuck in this. It's like very specific, like a tight space.
Yeah.
I'll follow up on what Richard said a little bit. When Sadie was still alive, but toward the end of her life, I always went and got their mail and sometimes read it to Moses if he couldn't find his glasses. But very interesting, she had financial requests from 40 different organizations, which then I figured thereafter she was sending $10 and $15 to every organization she felt was of worthy cause. So that's why she had all these requests coming in even after she passed. And I said, okay, now I know where Sadie's heart was, and because that's where the money went. It was interesting.
Absolutely. Well, just a couple of quick things to conclude this time. One is I'll mention that I will, in a few weeks, we'll be continuing on. So if you want to read ahead, please do so. We'll be moving on through. My guess is that most of our next few sessions, we're going to read a few chunks. I think what we'll probably do next time is, since we don't have all the preface stuff to deal with, we'll probably read a chunk, break into karutas, have the conversations there, then come back together and make it. So we'll probably do a few things of that. I'll probably give a little bit of short preface of anything I think that would give us some helpful context. But for the most part, the idea here is that we, as a community together, are going to be working through this. And I'm really, if you hadn't already figured this out, I'm kind of modeling this a little bit after when we did the project a few months ago for the Anabaptist Study Bible. This is kind of a similar technique a little bit. So anyway, so I'm really looking forward to the next round. But I'll also mention, just to kind of give you an anticipation of things to come, I think the next time I'm speaking is on Easter Sunday, and we're not doing James for Easter Sunday. And the reason for that is that we're talking about a few different things. One is Easter Sunday, of course, but also 20 years ago, Easter Sunday 20 years ago was when I first became part of this church. So I'm going to be reflecting a little bit on that time period, but especially also I'm going to talk about one of those beautiful high notes of our congregation's story. And I'm not going to tell you what that high note is. I'm going to leave you in suspense, but I think it's a sad but also beautiful story of when our congregation did the right thing, and some things that came from that. So I think it's a good theme for Easter Sunday. So I just wanted to build some anticipation. So anyway, that's the message.
Cool.